My son Trevor stood at the head of the table in his brand new restaurant on opening night, raised a glass of champagne toward the investors he'd spent months courting, and announced that everything he had built came from his own vision, his own sacrifice, and his own relentless belief in himself. I was sitting 3 tables away, holding a glass I hadn't touched. The woman beside him, his girlfriend Lacey Drummond, caught my eye for exactly half a second before looking away. That half second told me everything I'd been pretending not to know for the past 8 months. I didn't say a word. I just set my champagne down, picked up my coat from the back of the chair, and walked out into the cold Halifax night. The next morning, I canceled every automatic transfer connected to Harbor and Grain. My name is Meredith? No, wait. Let me start the way this story actually begins, not at the ending. Because if I start at the endings, you won't understand how a woman who spent 40 years being careful with money ended up handing most of it to someone who eventually couldn't remember to thank her. My husband Gordon passed away in the spring, 4 years ago now. Heart failure, the doctor said, as though the heart simply runs out of reasons to keep going. Gordon was 67. He had planned to retire the following September. We'd booked a trip to Prince Edward Island for our anniversary. Something small, something quiet, just the 2 of us walking along red cliff beaches the way we used to when we were young, and didn't need much to feel like everything was right with the world. We never took that trip. Gordon had been a civil engineer for the city of Halifax his entire career. Not glamorous work, but steady, honest, the kind of career built on showing up every single day and doing the thing correctly the first time. People trusted him because he never cut corners. If he said a bridge would hold, it held. That was Gordon. Before he died, he made sure I would be secure. He left me our house on Roby Street, a modest pension, a life insurance policy we had maintained carefully for decades, and strict instructions, written in that clear handwriting of his, that I was not to let anyone pressure me into anything. I remember reading those instructions alone in the kitchen the week after the funeral, and almost laughing, because Gordon always knew my weakness. I trusted people I loved too completely. Our son Trevor was 34 when his father died. They had been close, in the uncomplicated way of fathers and sons who share the same appetite for big projects. Trevor had worked in restaurant management since his mid-20s. Good at it, too. He understood service atmosphere, the particular rhythm of a busy kitchen. But he had always wanted something of his own. He used to talk about it over Sunday dinners, this idea he had for a restaurant that would feel like a proper Nova Scotia kitchen. Local sourcing, seasonal menus, real food for real people. Nothing pretentious. He wanted it to feel like coming home. After Gordon died, Trevor called more. He came over for dinner on Sundays and helped me in the garden, the way Gordon used to, pulling weeds, staking the tomatoes, doing the small physical tasks of grief that give your hands something to hold on to. Those months were some of the most tender I can remember between us, not because everything was fine, because nothing was fine, but because we were both hurting, and at least we were honest about it. Then, about a year after the funeral, Trevor sat down across from me at the kitchen table with his laptop and showed me a location on Barrington Street. Old brick building, wide windows, high ceilings. He had already spoken to the landlord informally. The space had been a furniture showroom and before that a textile warehouse. The bones were beautiful. I want to call it Harbor and Grain, he said. He looked nervous saying it, the way people look when they've been carrying something privately for too long and finally let it out into the room. I looked at his face. He looked alive in a way I hadn't seen since before his father got sick. What would Gordon have said? I thought. I didn't have to think very long. Tell me what you need, I said. Over the next several months, I helped Trevor build what he described. I covered the security deposit and the first year of commercial rent. I contributed toward the kitchen equipment, the custom millwork for the bar, the lighting, the initial inventory. I dipped into a portion of Gordon's life insurance to help cover the hiring and training phase, before the restaurant could generate its own payroll. Every time I wrote a check, Trevor hugged me in the doorway like he was 12 years old again. He called me his anchor. He said he couldn't do any of it without me. I believed him. Mothers are almost required to. I spent weekends at Harbor and Grain during the renovation, bringing coffee and sandwiches, sweeping sawdust off freshly laid floors, helping Trevor arrange the shelving in the dry storage room because he couldn't decide between two configurations. Those were good days, tiring in the way that feels meaningful. The kind of tired that comes from building something instead of just enduring something. Then Lacey Drummond arrived. The first time I met her, Trevor introduced her as someone who had been helping him think through the brand positioning, which was a phrase I had never heard him use before. She was 31, attractive in a polished way, with the kind of easy confidence that fills a room before a person even speaks. She had worked for a marketing consultancy in Toronto before moving to Halifax, she said. She knew the food and beverage industry. She'd helped launch several restaurant concepts. She shook my hand and smiled. "You must be the wonderful woman who made all of this possible," she said. At the time, I thought that sounded generous. Later, I understood she was simply cataloging what I was worth to the project. The changes came slowly, which is how they always come when someone is being careful about them. First, the menu concept shifted. Trevor's original idea, that warm, unpretentious maritime kitchen feel, began softening around the edges. Lacey talked about premium positioning, about attracting a clientele willing to spend properly on a dining experience. The local suppliers Trevor had spent months cultivating got quietly replaced with more expensive regional brands that photographed better. The chalkboard menu became a printed card with letterpress typography. The bar shifted from Nova Scotia craft beer toward a curated cocktail program. None of these changes were wrong, exactly. A business can evolve. But each one came with a price tag, and Lacey always had a reason why the price tag was actually an investment. "Your mother would understand," she told Trevor once, when I overheard them arguing softly near the service station. I was in the back office reorganizing the schedule binders when I heard her say it. "She wants this to succeed. She knows building something real costs real money." I stood very still in the office and listened to the silence that followed. Trevor didn't argue. About 4 months before Harbor and Grain opened, the requests came faster and in larger amounts. I didn't fully track them at first because each one sounded temporary. Cash flow gap before the supplier accounts activate. Marketing retainer to build pre-opening buzz. A hospitality consultant Lacey had recommended who charged $3,000 for what amounted to 2 afternoons of walkthroughs and a report I found difficult to understand. Then I found the invoices. I wasn't looking for them. I was helping Trevor organize paperwork for his accountant because tax season was approaching and his files were scattered across 2 laptops and a cardboard box under the prep counter. That's when I saw the billing statements from something called Drummond Strategy Group. Lacey's last name was Drummond. I counted 11 invoices over 6 months. The smallest was $4,000. The largest was $9,000. The descriptions were imprecise in that deliberate way. Brand architecture consultation, market entry facilitation, experiential positioning review. The kind of language that sounds important enough that a young business owner wouldn't question it. I set the invoices down carefully on the prep counter and looked out the window at Barrington Street. Then I asked Trevor about them that same evening. His reaction surprised me. Not anger, not explanation. Deflection. He looked at the invoices briefly, then said Lacey's input had been essential to the whole vision. He said she understood the market in ways neither of us could. He said her fees were industry standard. "Are you paying her from the business account?" I asked. "She's a contractor. That's how contractors work." "Trevor, that's over $40,000. He crossed his arms the way he used to as a teenager, when he was certain he was right, and equally certain I wasn't going to agree. "Mom, I need you to trust me." That phrase, I had heard it before, from my own mother, from Gordon's brother, when he needed to borrow money for a car he couldn't afford. Trust me meant please don't look any closer. I didn't push further that evening. I went home and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and Gordon's photograph on the table beside me, and I told him, out loud, softly, the way you talk to people who aren't there anymore, that something felt wrong. The relationship between Trevor and Lacey had also changed in ways I couldn't quite name. She no longer came to the restaurant as a consultant. She came as a partner, or at least that's how she carried herself. She finished his sentences. She redirected conversations away from me when I asked questions. When suppliers called, she answered. When the kitchen manager needed a decision, he went to her first. One afternoon, I arrived at the restaurant to drop off extra linen I'd sourced from a hotel supply sale, and I found Lacey alone in the office reviewing vendor contracts. She looked up without particular surprise. "Trevor's out meeting with the beverage rep," she said. Then, pleasantly, "You don't need to keep bringing things by, Meredith. We have systems now." Systems. As though my presence had become administrative rather than personal. As though I was a volunteer who hadn't yet realized the project had moved on without her. I set the linen down carefully. "I'll just leave these then." She nodded and returned to her contracts. I drove home and called my friend Patricia Osborne, who had known me for 30 years and who had the particular gift of saying exactly what I needed to hear without making me feel stupid for not having seen it already. Patricia arrived an hour later with grocery store cookies and a no-nonsense expression. "How much total?" she asked, once I'd gone through everything. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "And how much of that came from Gordon's insurance?" I looked at the table. "Diana," she said gently. She still called me by the nickname from our nursing school days. "This isn't just about a restaurant. I know he's letting her make decisions that should be his to make. And every time she spends money on her company's invoices, she earns more whether the restaurant succeeds or not." I had understood this separately in pieces. Hearing it assembled clearly was different. Patricia stayed for 2 hours. We went through every statement I had copies of, everything from the original lease agreement to the invoices for Drummond's strategy group. The more we looked, the clearer the pattern became. Lacey's fees were not tied to Harbor & Grain's performance. They were tied to expenditure. The more Trevor spent, the more she billed. She had every financial incentive to encourage expansion and growth regardless of whether the restaurant was ready for either. "What does Trevor see in her?" Patricia asked at one point. "He sees someone who believes he's going to be important," I said. Patricia looked at me steadily. "And does he need that because Gordon isn't here to tell him?" I couldn't answer that without crying, so I didn't. The week before opening, Trevor called and asked me to meet him at the restaurant early one morning. "Just the two of us," he said. I arrived to find the space looking genuinely beautiful in the winter morning light. The millwork at the bar glowed warm and golden. The tables were set with linen and small glass vases. Everything Trevor had described in that first excited conversation was there, somewhere underneath all the renovations and repositioning and premium branding consultations. Then I noticed Lacey sitting in the corner booth, reviewing what looked like financial documents. Trevor handed me a coffee and sat across from me at the bar. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping properly for weeks. "I need to ask you something," he said. He told me that a business development firm in Toronto was interested in a second location if Harbor & Grain's opening performed well. Halifax to Toronto was a natural trajectory for the brand. Lacey had already been in conversations with their team. The opportunity was real, he said. But to be positioned credibly for that conversation, they needed to demonstrate financial capacity. The bank would provide a commercial expansion line of credit, he explained. But they needed an additional guarantor. He slid a document across the bar toward me. I recognized the line at the bottom where my signature was meant to go, and I recognized the word in the accompanying description that told me exactly what the bank would hold as security if the loan went into default. "That's the house," I said. "It's collateral. It's standard." "Trevor." I looked at him directly. "This restaurant hasn't had a single service yet." He exhaled. "Lacey says the timing is exactly right. Getting ahead of demand is how real brands scale. And if the first location struggles, it won't. But if it does." He looked at the document, then back at me. "I need you to trust me, Mom." There it was again. I looked across the restaurant at Lacey in the corner booth. She was not pretending to work on something else. She was watching us. When she saw me notice, she gave me a small, composed smile. I folded the document carefully and handed it back to Trevor. "I can't sign this," I said. The color in his face changed instantly. "Why not?" "Because I won't put Gordon's house on the line for a business that hasn't opened yet." "His house!" Trevor's voice went flat. "You always call it his house, because he worked 40 years to pay for it." Trevor stood up from the bar stool. "So did I contribute nothing? I gave up 3 years of my career to build this." "I know you did. That's not what I said." "You sound exactly like you don't believe this is going to work." I said I won't sign. I kept my voice even. Those are not the same thing. Lacey crossed the room quietly and placed her hand on Trevor's arm. Maybe give it a few days, she said smoothly. Opening week is stressful. Decisions made under pressure aren't always clear. I looked at her. That's very reasonable advice, she smiled. We all want the same thing here. I picked up my coat. I hope that's true. Opening night was a Friday in November. The restaurant was full. Halifax is small enough that new openings generate real curiosity, and Trevor had worked hard enough for long enough that people turned out genuinely wanting him to succeed. The food was good, I thought, though I might be biased. The kitchen ran clean. The service was warm. There were moments that night, watching Trevor move through the room, that I felt something uncomplicated and proud rise up in my chest. Then a colleague of mine, a woman named Sandra Vance who taught secondary school with me before I retired, leaned close at our table and said, "Isn't that his girlfriend presenting to the investors in the back?" I turned. Through the glass partition of the private dining room, I could see Lacey at the head of a table of 6 people, standing beside a projection screen. Her presentation was already underway. She's been talking about second locations, Sandra said. I overheard her in the hallway. She mentioned an anchor investor model. I excused myself from the table and walked slowly toward the private room. Through the glass, I could hear Lacey clearly. The Halifax concept proves the model, she was saying. Trevor's strength is operations. My contribution is growth strategy. What we're offering investors is a partnership structured for replication. Partnership. That word had never been discussed with me. Not once. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then Trevor appeared beside me. He looked flushed and pleased until he saw my expression. What's wrong? Is Lacey your business partner? He hesitated for exactly the length of time that confirmed he knew I didn't know. We've been discussing a formal arrangement. When were you going to tell me? Mom, not tonight. Trevor, not tonight. His voice was low, careful, controlled in a way that felt rehearsed. This is the most important night of my career. Can you please just... He stopped, took a breath. Can you please just let me have this? I looked at my son standing in the doorway of the restaurant I had helped him build, asking me not to ask questions. And I said, very quietly, I am so proud of what you've built here. Then I went back to my table, finished my meal, said goodbye to Sandra, collected my coat, and walked out into the cold. The next morning, I canceled the automatic transfers. I did it the same way I had always done important things, alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, while the house was still and the street outside was quiet. Gordon's photograph was there. I didn't talk to it this time. I just looked at it for a while. Then I opened my laptop and went through every automatic payment connected to the restaurant. Monthly operating support. Inventory reserve transfers. Marketing contribution installments. Each one I canceled with a single click, and each click felt less like cruelty and more like finally removing my hand from a door I had been holding open. So long my arm had stopped feeling the strain. I wrote Trevor an email I rewrote 4 times. The first version was too emotional. The second was too cold. The third sounded like an ultimatum from a landlord. The fourth was simply true. I told him I loved him and I was proud of him. I told him I would not be providing further financial support to Harbor and Grain until I had received complete and transparent accounting records, including all payments made to Drummond Strategy Group. I told him I had questions about the role Lacey played in the business that I needed answered honestly before I could continue. And I told him, because it was true, and because he needed to hear it, that stopping support was not the same as stopping love. He called 11 times before noon. I listened to the voicemails in order. The first was confused, the second was hurt, the fifth was angry, the eighth was quiet and frightened in a way that almost broke my resolve. But not quite. The 10th message was from Lacey Sacy. She did not identify herself at first. She said she was calling on Trevor's behalf because he was too upset to speak clearly, and that she wanted to discuss the situation professionally. She said, my decision had created payroll complications that could affect the staff Trevor had hired. She said she understood I had concerns, but that this was not the moment to act on them. I listened to the message twice. Then I called Patricia. She left you a voicemail, Patricia said flatly. She did, not Trevor. He left 10. She left 1. Patricia was quiet for a moment. What does that tell you? That she considers herself the decision maker. Yes. I had already been in touch with a solicitor named Lawrence Holt, recommended through the legal clinic at the community center, where I volunteered on Thursday mornings. Lawrence was careful and direct, the kind of man who used plain language because he respected the people he spoke to. I brought him everything: the invoices, the original contribution agreements I'd signed when I first started funding the restaurant, the document Trevor had asked me to sign about the house. Lawrence reviewed the papers for a long time without speaking. Then he set them down and removed his glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I use my maiden name now. Have for years. You have not signed anything that puts you in direct financial liability beyond what you've already contributed. That's something. It is. He tapped the unsigned house document. Had you signed this, the situation would be significantly more complicated. He turned to the Drummond Strategy Group invoices. These compensation structures are unusual for a small, independent restaurant. Her fees appear to escalate in proportion to marketing and expansion spending. So the more money gets spent, the more she earns. He nodded. Whether the business is profitable or not, I sat with that for a moment. Is any of it illegal? Questionable. Potentially exploitative. Whether it rises to actionable fraud depends on several things we would need to investigate. He looked at me steadily. But I want to make sure you understand something clearly. You are under no legal obligation to continue funding this business, and your son is an adult who has signed these agreements himself. That last sentence was the hardest one, because Trevor had signed. He wasn't entirely a victim. He had made choices, and some of those choices had been unkind to me. 2 days later, Trevor came to the house. Without Lacey, that mattered. He stood on the porch in a gray jacket, looking like he hadn't slept since Friday. I opened the door without saying anything and moved aside to let him in. He sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee neither of us particularly wanted. For a while we were just quiet together, which we hadn't been in a long time. The house made its small sounds. The radiator clicked. Someone's dog barked twice down the street and then stopped. Finally, Trevor said, I didn't know about all the invoices. Which ones did you know about? He rubbed his eyes. I knew she was billing the company. I didn't track the totals. Why not? He was quiet. Trevor, because she managed that side of things. He looked ashamed. She said managing the financial administration was part of what she brought to the project. And I let her because I didn't want to. He stopped. Didn't want to what? He looked at the table. Didn't want to look like I couldn't handle it. There it was. The thing underneath everything else. Gordon's death had left a particular silence in Trevor's life, and Lacey had walked into that silence, speaking in exactly the voice he most needed to hear. Confident, certain, telling him he was exceptional. She made you feel like your father used to, I said softly. He looked up quickly. Not in a wrong way, I clarified. Just that way someone has of making you feel like you can do the thing. His eyes filled immediately, and he looked away toward the window, the way men his age do when they're trying to decide whether to cry. Dad would have caught all of this, he said. Your father would have asked questions the first week. Trevor almost smiled. He would have driven Lacey insane. He drove everyone insane, I said. He was thorough. We were quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that holds something instead of hiding something. Eventually, Trevor said, I think she was planning to take equity. I set down my coffee cup. Tell me what you mean. He slid his phone across the table. On the screen was an email thread between Lacey and someone in Toronto. I read it slowly, carefully, the way Lawrence had taught me to read documents. The language was precise in places and deliberately vague in others. But the meaning, once you understood what you were looking for, was clear enough. If Harbor and Grain required significant debt restructuring within its first 18 months, something that became increasingly likely given the spending trajectory, Lacey had positioned herself to convert her outstanding consulting fees into ownership equity. The more debt Trevor accumulated, the more leverage Lacey would have over the business he'd built. I looked up from the screen. Trevor was watching me. I found it 2 nights ago. I've barely slept since. How did you find it? She left her email open on the office computer. He rubbed the back of his neck. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a supplier confirmation and I saw my name. I handed the phone back carefully. Does she know you've seen it? No. I thought about Gordon, about his cedar-colored workshop at the back of the old garage, about the way he used to say that the most dangerous kinds of problems were the ones that looked like opportunities. Not because he was cynical, because he'd been in the trades long enough to know the difference between someone building alongside you and someone building around you. You need to talk to a solicitor, I said. I know. Today, Trevor, not next week. I know. He looked at me carefully. Are you angry? I considered the question honestly. I'm tired, I said finally. I'm tired and I'm sad and I'm a little bit angry, yes, but I'm your mother. His face did something complicated then. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, something in between that doesn't have a clean name. I let her talk about you, he said quietly, in front of staff, in front of suppliers. I let her call you. He stopped. She used to call you the nervous investor, and I didn't correct her. The kitchen was very still. That hurt me, I said. I know. I wasn't a nervous investor, Trevor. I was your mother. I know. His voice was barely audible. I know that. We stayed at the table for another hour. He told me things I hadn't known. About the nights he'd spent in the restaurant after closing, second-guessing decisions Lacey had already implemented, about the slow realization that the restaurant he was building no longer quite matched the one he had described to me at this same table 2 years ago, about the way she'd argued him out of featuring the local cheesemaker from the Annapolis Valley because it wasn't on brand, about the time she'd told him his instincts were sentimental, as though sentimentality was a liability rather than the entire foundation of what made Harbor and Grain worth caring about in the first place. I listened without interrupting. That was the most useful thing I could do. Before he left, he stopped in the hallway and looked at the photograph of Gordon that I keep on the small table by the door. Gordon in his hard hat, squinting against summer sun on some job site years ago, grinning because a colleague had said something funny just before the camera went off. It's one of the only photographs where he looks entirely like himself. What would he have done? Trevor asked. He would have asked her to show him the books in the first meeting, I said. And then he would have built you the shelving in the dry storage room himself instead of paying a contractor. Trevor looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he said, I'm going to fix this. I believe he meant it. That's something. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. Real situations never are. Lawrence Holt sent a formal letter to Lacey Drummond, requesting documentation of all services billed through Drummond Strategy Group. Her response came through her own solicitor, which confirmed what we already suspected, that she had been anticipating exactly this kind of scrutiny. Several of her invoices, when examined against the dates of actual deliverables, were difficult to substantiate. The Toronto investor correspondence, once Trevor shared it formally, raised enough concerns about her intentions that the conversation with the expansion firm stalled immediately. Lacey didn't vanish cleanly. These things rarely end cleanly. She contested several of the invoice disputes and maintained for some time that Trevor had understood and approved everything. But Trevor had the emails now, and Trevor had finally asked to see the actual business accounts and what he found there, combined with the documentation I had compiled with Patricia over those long evenings at my kitchen table, was enough to give Lawrence something substantive to work with. Eventually, Lacey Drummond removed herself from Harbor and Grain. The formal dissolution of her consulting arrangement came 3 months after opening night. Trevor said she left the office files in reasonable order, which surprised him. Lawrence told me that was not unusual. People who are careful about documentation tend to be careful about exits too. Harbor and Grain survived, which surprised some people and didn't surprise me at all. Because whatever Lacey had added or subtracted or redirected, the original thing was still there underneath it. The kitchen ran clean. The food was honest. Trevor knew how to read a room and make people feel welcome, and that is not a skill that can be invented or marketed or billed as a consulting deliverable. It's just what he is. He called me the week after Lacey left. The Annapolis Valley cheesemaker, he said. I've been thinking about reaching back out to her. Her name is Bernadette, I said. You mentioned her in the very first version of the menu. Silence. You remembered that? I remember everything you told me about what you wanted this to be. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry, Mom. I've said it before, but I want to say it properly. Not just for the money. For for the nervous investor thing, for letting her be the person who answered when suppliers called, for not introducing you at opening night the way I should have. How should you have introduced me? Another pause. As the person who made it possible. I sat in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and let that land where it needed to land. There's one more thing, he said. What? I want to build something in the restaurant. A small thing. There's a section of bare wall near the entrance where we've been meaning to hang something, and I've been thinking. He paused. Dad used to make those small maple frames, remember? For photographs. I still have 3 of them. I want to put up a photograph of the 2 of you, if that's all right. I didn't answer immediately because I couldn't. Mom? That's all right, I said. By spring, Harbor and Grain had settled into itself. The rush of opening had smoothed into something steadier. Trevor hired a part-time kitchen manager who had trained in Lunenburg and a front-of-house lead who had worked 2 seasons at a well-regarded inn on Cape Breton. The menu was shorter than Lacey had wanted and more interesting. The local cheesemaker from the Annapolis Valley had a dedicated section on the small plates menu. I went for dinner on a Thursday evening in April with Patricia and her husband, Joel. We had the mushroom broth with fiddleheads to start, which tasted like exactly the kind of spring that reminds you why you live somewhere with real seasons. Trevor came to the table briefly, not to hover, just to say hello. He looked like himself. That's the only way I know to describe it. Not polished, not positioned, himself. After he walked back toward the kitchen, Patricia touched my hand across the table. He looks like his father, she said. I know, I said. He always has. On the drive home along the harbor, I watched the lights on the water and thought about the version of this story where I had signed that document, where the house had become collateral, where Lacey's plan had moved forward without interruption. It wasn't a difficult version to imagine. And imagining it briefly was enough. Gordon used to say that the people who love you most are the ones most likely to accidentally ask you to carry something too heavy. Not because they want to hurt you, because they trust you completely, and sometimes trust is heavy. He was right about most things. I turned off the harbor road and drove home to the house on Roby Street. The porch light was on, the way I always leave it when I go out at night, because coming home to a lit porch is one of the small things I have kept for myself. Gordon started that habit. I don't intend to stop it. Some things survive the people who begin them. That's not a consolation. It's just true.